94 Africans arrived at Harbor Point, Maryland on September 29, 1767, aboard the slave ship the Kingfisher. 40 had perished during the crossing. Among the survivors was a 17-year-old Mandinka youth who would spend the next 5 decades refusing to forget the name he had been born with. Records from Riverbend County, Virginia, list a slave purchased that October, assigned the new name, Daniel. What those records don't mention, what plantation ledgers deliberately erased, and what family Bibles refused to acknowledge, was the systematic effort to strip a man of identity, memory, and culture. This is the story of how one African transformed brutality meant to break him into a legacy that outlived the people who tried to own him. What you're about to hear has been buried beneath centuries of silence, and the truth is far more disturbing than anything America has ever taught. The Gambia River carved through West Africa like a wound that never healed, carrying European ships deeper inland than any other waterway on that coast. By 1767, the trading compound at Fort Bardeau had processed tens of thousands of captured Africans, but the demand from Virginia tobacco plantations had reached unprecedented heights. Conflicts between kingdoms filled the forests with raiders eager to profit, and the Royal Africa Company paid premium rates for young men with warrior training. In the Mandinka village of Banisira, just 2 miles from the British fort, the Jalo clan maintained its lineage of blacksmiths and holy men, despite constant threat of raids. The Mandinka survived by giving Europeans the illusion of cooperation while preserving their traditions in secret. They taught their children to avoid the riverbanks, to never walk alone in the deeper forest, and to run at the first sign of slatty raiders, the African traffickers who supplied captives to European buyers. Malik Jalo, a respected blacksmith, understood these dangers more than most. He had seen the iron shackles passed through the fort, heard the stories of whole families disappearing overnight, and understood exactly how much a European captain would pay for a young Mandinka male. His eldest son, Malik, meaning one who stands firm, was trained early not only in the family craft of shaping metal and carving drumwood, but also in the history and dignity of his ancestors. At 17, Malik had completed his manhood training. He could hunt with a spear, recite his lineage across 7 generations, and craft a drum whose sound carried the memory of Mandinka lands. The elders often said he would one day lead the Jalo family as a wise man. On a humid morning in July 1767, he walked alone into the forest to gather specific hardwood for drum making. It grew only 3 miles from Banisira, far enough to be risky, but close enough that many young men made the trip without fear. Malik carried no weapon. Mandinka warriors did not hunt in sacred gathering grounds, and he moved with the confidence of someone who knew every path as intimately as breath. What Malik didn't know was that a British officer named Colonel Harwood had arrived at Fort Bardeau 3 days earlier with urgent orders. Virginia's harvest season loomed, labor shortages were severe, and the Kingfisher needed to sail with a full human cargo, at least 140 captives, before the weather shifted. African raiding networks had already been paid bonuses for young men between 15 and 25. 4 Sladies shadowed Malik from the moment he stepped under the canopy. They were professionals, perfectionists in the art of human capture. The attack lasted less than a minute. A club struck Malik's shoulder from behind, sending him to his knees. Hands clamped over his mouth, others seized his arms. A blindfold cut out the world. A gag stole his voice. Rope bit into his wrists. One moment he was a free Mandinka youth gathering wood. 90 seconds later, he was merchandise. The raiders dragged him to a temporary enclosure by the river where 24 captives already waited. Some were from neighboring villages, others had been marched from the interior weeks earlier. All of them wore the same stunned expression, human spirits grappling with sudden dehumanization. Malik spent 3 days in that holding pen. Food came rarely. Water even less. Guards beat anyone who cried out or prayed too loudly. The purpose was simple: weaken the will, break the mind, preserve the body. When the crew of the Kingfisher arrived to examine the captives, they brought a ship's surgeon whose detached inspection treated them like livestock. Malik passed every requirement. 17, strong, no visible injuries. The slatees were paid in rum and textiles, and Malik was recorded in the captain's manifest simply as male, approximately 17, Mandinka origin. Not Malik Jalo, not a son, not an heir to a lineage, just cargo. The journey from shore to ship happened in small boats of 10 captives each. Malik saw the massive ship looming, the floating prison designed for the Middle Passage. The ship stank of human waste. Through the small openings of the lower deck, he could see eyes looking out, hollow and watchful. The new captives were forced below deck, where the reality of the slavehold engulfed them. 5 feet of vertical space, wooden shelves stacked to double capacity, 16 inches allocated per body. Heat thick enough to choke, chains linking ankle to ankle, wrist to wall, one person's breath becoming another's only air. Malik was chained beside a man named Tombo from an inland village. They barely shared a language, but Mandinka roots allowed enough communication to survive. Tombo explained the routines, the single daily meal, the rationed water, the beatings. He explained that resistance below deck meant death, and death below deck often meant being left shackled to a corpse until someone noticed. Malik listened, but did not speak much. Warrior training had taught him how to stay silent without surrendering. The ship waited another week to fill its cargo. Disease circulated instantly: dysentery, fever, rotting wounds. The surgeon took notes but provided no treatment. The Kingfisher finally departed Africa on July 5, 1767, carrying 140 chained Africans into the ocean that swallowed worlds whole. Malik noticed patterns even in hell. When sailors were distracted by storms, routines grew sloppy. When food was brought, guards were less vigilant. When captives were forced to the deck for exercise, whispers could travel. These observations weren't escape plans, they were survival instincts, tiny pockets of mental resistance. 3 weeks in, fever struck the hold. Men died in their chains. Malik's partner Tombo developed chills, then delirium, then silence. Malik remained chained to his corpse for nearly a day before the body was dragged away. After that, they chained Malik directly to the wall, leaving him even more alone. That isolation almost broke him. Almost. But not quite. Because his father had told him one truth no ship could take. Your name is the last thing you own. Never let anyone steal it. And so, every morning, Malik whispered into the darkness, "I am Malik Jalo, son of Moru Jalo, of Banira, of the Mandinka people." The name kept him alive. For more than half a century, the Whitaker case lay dormant, packed into a thin folder inside a metal cabinet in the Louisiana State Archives. Clerks checked its box only during routine inventory, sliding it back into place each time without reading a single line. The label on the front slowly faded, the ink turning from black to gray, then to pale silver. Whitaker, Robert and Elaine, missing persons, 1947. Status, undetermined. Decades passed. Roads were paved. The old lumber mill changed hands twice, and the Whitaker house passed from owner to owner. Its walls repainted, its floors refinished, its fireplace used to warm holiday gatherings of families who knew nothing about the past. And the only person who ever doubted the official story, Sheriff Walter Dumont, took that doubt with him to his grave in 1972. His private notes, whatever he'd written in the moments when duty and instinct warred inside him, were never found. Daniel Whitaker left Louisiana, eventually settling in Texas, later drifting to Oklahoma. No marriage, no children, a quiet life ending with a quiet death in 1982. When he passed, the last living witness to the night his parents disappeared was gone. By the time the year 2005 arrived, the Whitakers were no more than a footnote in a forgotten file, until the cold case unit opened. The Louisiana State Police launched the statewide initiative that year, backed by federal funds. Its mission: digitize old records, apply modern forensic science where none existed before, and re-examine every suspicious disappearance predating 1950. Investigator Megan Crowell, 39, joined the task force with a reputation for being relentless. She'd rebuilt cases from scraps of evidence before, turning faded memories and lost documents into answers families had waited for. She wasn't one to be intimidated by messy files or stories too decayed to make sense. She worked methodically, labeling, sorting, scanning. Some files were thick, filled with witness statements and evidence logs. Others were nearly empty, a few yellowed pages and a single black and white photo. That's what caught her eye. The Whitaker file sat thin and forgotten among hundreds of others. Something about its sparseness made her pause. Too few details for a double disappearance. Too neat. Too quick. She slid the folder onto her desk, sat down, and began reading. The case summary matched what history remembered. Couple gone without trace. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. House neat. Car untouched. Son present, but unhelpful. Then she saw a line handwritten on the back of the final report, almost lost to time. Something's not right, but can't prove it. W.D. Sheriff Walter Dumont's private note. It wasn't part of the official record. Someone had scribbled it there after the report was typed. Megan felt the hair on her arms rise. She moved to the old photographs, black and white images inside the Whitaker home, the overturned coffee table, the dark stain on the rug, the fireplace, the grainy shadows in the corners. Then she noticed something strange. The diagram in the report placed the stain near the middle of the room, but the photo clearly showed the stain near the wall, under the window. An inconsistency, not definitive, but troubling. She checked the fireplace image next. The ash photographed in 1947 looked unusually pale, almost white, not the typical dark ash from wood burning. She zoomed in, noticing flecks of something lighter mixed in. But the lab report in 1947 dismissed it as plaster, lime, or ceramic fragments, nothing concerning. Still, Megan had worked enough cases to know ash told stories, and white ash, especially in quantities shown in the picture, was rare. Her eyes drifted to a margin note written in blue ink on the lab copy. Item destroyed. S.W. Duvall. Destroyed? By whose authority? No corresponding order existed, and the handwriting didn't match Dumont's signature on other documents. She flipped to the end of the report. No trace of the evidence, no explanation, no chain of custody logs. It all felt wrong. She closed the folder and stared at it for a long moment before writing the case on her personal list. Priority review, possible irregularities. 3 days later, she contacted the State Archives property officer, requesting any physical evidence tied to File 47B. The officer hesitated. They'd recently flagged that box for potential deterioration during inventory. When the box arrived, Megan opened it under sterile lights. The smell of old dust and damp paper drifted out. Inside were sealed cloth bags, some torn from age. Labels written in fading ink. Rug sample, ash sample, FP, metal fragments, porcelain shards. But some bags were missing entirely, specifically those referencing the fireplace cavity. She carefully lifted each bag, checking signatures.
Dumont's name appeared repeatedly, but the pen type and handwriting varied enough to raise her suspicion. Then she froze. Something inside one of the bags rattled faintly, metal scraping cloth. It hadn't been cataloged in the official record, none, yet here it was, tucked away in a bag Dumont supposedly sealed. Megan noted the black streak etched across the rim. Lab technicians later confirmed what she suspected. The residue contained traces of human protein. Something violent happened inside the Whitaker house. The shell casing belonged to a shotgun registered to Robert Whitaker during the war. But if the shell was fired, where was the gun? Where was the body? Why had it been hidden? Who moved evidence? And most importantly, why was it never included in the official findings? Megan leaned back in her chair, heart pumping. She felt it now, as clear as the humid Louisiana evening pressing against her office window. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a crime scene, a buried one, cleaned up, rewritten, stripped of truth, and someone decades earlier had helped bury it. She signed a formal request, reopen investigation, Whitaker case. That night, the file sat alone on her desk, its yellowed pages illuminated under the desk lamp. For the first time in 60 years, the silence inside that old white house was beginning to crack.
After 11 weeks at sea, the smell of land filled the air. Grass, soil, smoke, something unfamiliar and unsettling. Then the great ship slowed. Voices on deck shouted to one another. The chain of the anchor thundered into the water. The Kingfisher had reached Harbor Point, Maryland. Malik could not see the shoreline, only the brief flashes of color through the ventilation slit. White buildings, tall masts, pale faces moving along the docks. But the sound of the harbor was unmistakable. Hammers, boots, cartwheels, distant cattle, English words he could not understand. A world he had never imagined now stretched before him, cold and vast. The captives were brought up in small groups for inspection. The sunlight stabbed Malik's eyes, and the sudden openness made him dizzy. White men swarmed around the captives like traders evaluating horses. They checked teeth, squeezed muscles, prodded limbs, examined scars. Malik felt hands grab his jaw, turn his head, push against his arms. A man scribbled something on a clipboard. Another stroked his chin as if considering a purchase. Not once did anyone say his name. They never asked. To them, he was not Malik. He was a Mandinka male of 17, strong, healthy, valuable. An advertisement appeared in the Maryland Chronicle 2 days later. Just arrived aboard the ship Kingfisher from the River Gambia, a cargo of strong, healthy Africans suitable for field labor, to be sold Tuesday next at Harbor Point. On the day of the auction, land buyers crowded into the tavern yard where the sales took place. Malik stood in a line with other young men, chained at the wrists, while man assessed them with cool, appraising eyes. One of those men was Samuel Harper, the owner of a tobacco plantation in Riverbend County, Virginia. Harper was in need of new laborers. Disease and overwork had claimed several of his workers recently, and tobacco demanded more bodies than any other crop. Harper studied Malik with interest. He saw strength in Malik's shoulders, endurance in his posture, and intelligence in the way the young African watched everything silently. Malik's eyes met his, and for a moment, Harper felt something unsettling, defiance perhaps, or a hardness that did not match the bow of his head. But to a white landowner desperate for strong field hands, defiance merely meant spirit, and spirit meant potential. He bid quickly, outmatching the others. The sale was recorded. Negro male, estimated 17, sold to Mr. Samuel Harper of Riverbend County, Virginia. Malik was taken with 3 other newly purchased slaves. They were loaded onto a wagon like sacks of grain, wrists still shackled, feet bound with rope. The journey into Virginia lasted 3 days. Malik saw forests he did not recognize, rivers he could not name, white houses that all looked alike.
At night, he was given water and a small portion of dry bread. Each night, he whispered his name. Each night, he rebuilt the memory the ocean had tried to erase. The Harper plantation sprawled across several hundred acres in Riverbend County, bordered by the slow-moving Rappahannock River. It was a world built on tobacco, hot summers, relentless planting, endless weeding, and back-breaking harvesting. The enslaved people who lived there had long ago been broken to obedience, or at least the appearance of it. An overseer named Fitch ran the day-to-day operations. Fitch's authority came from his whip, and he used it often. When Malik arrived, the enslaved workers watched him with a familiar mix of curiosity and sorrow. They all had once been newcomers. They all knew what lay ahead. Some wondered whether he would break quickly. Others hoped he wouldn't. A few silently prayed for him. Samuel Harper wasted no time renaming his new property. Standing on the packed dirt yard, Harper pointed at Malik and announced, "This one will be called Daniel." It was written immediately into the plantation ledger. Daniel, an English name with no meaning for Malik, a name chosen solely because it was easier for white tongues to command. Overseer Fitch repeated it loudly, pointing at him. "Daniel." Malik lifted his head and said clearly, "My name is Malik Jalo." The overseer blinked, confused. He repeated the name again, slower, louder. "Daniel." Malik, bruised from travel but unbroken, answered again, "Malik Jalo." The overseer struck him across the face. Malik steadied himself and spoke his name a third time. And in that instant, before the plantation even learned who he was, the battle that would define his entire life had already begun.
Fitch had dealt with stubborn Africans before, but never one who met violence with the same calm insistence that Malik showed. The overseer hit him again, harder this time, a blow meant to stagger the spirits as much as the body. Malik steadied himself, tasted blood in his mouth, and repeated his name exactly as he had before. To Fitch, this was not defiance in the heroic sense, it was an inconvenience, a problem to be solved through force. Yet something in Malik's eyes, unbroken, unafraid, made the overseer feel a twitch of irritation. He barked for the others to drag Malik to the slave quarters, muttering that the African would learn soon enough. But the next day, and the day after that, the conflict continued. Each time a white man pointed at him and said "Daniel," Malik corrected them calmly, firmly, with the full weight of his father's teachings behind him. The enslaved workers watched this with a mix of dread and awe. No one else on the plantation dared to assert their African names. Some had forgotten theirs entirely after decades of forced obedience. Malik's refusal did not simply break the rules of the plantation, it broke the unwritten rule of survival: bend early or be broken. By the third day, Samuel Harper realized this newcomer needed a lesson, a public one. Harper believed deeply in orderly domination, discipline that asserted authority without reducing the value of the labor he owned. He ordered Malik tied to a whipping post in the center of the yard, ensuring every enslaved man, woman, and child had a clear view. The message was not only for Malik, it was for all of them. Fitch stepped forward with a wide leather strap, designed not to kill, but to inflict unforgettable agony. Harper stood beside him, arms crossed, voice calm. "What is your name?" he asked. Malik lifted his chin. "Malik Jalo." The strap cracked across his back with a sound like tearing cloth. He felt the skin split, fire spreading across his shoulders. Harper waited, then repeated the question. "What is your name?" Malik swallowed, tasted iron, and said again, "Malik Jalo." Another strike, then another. Each blow opened new cuts, spreading blood across his back and ribs. Yet his voice, though shaking, did not falter. The enslaved workers watching gasped softly or closed their eyes. Some prayed under their breath. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Over and over the ritual played out. Question, name, blow. Question, name, blow. By the 20th strike, Malik's knees trembled. By the 30th, he could barely breathe. Blood soaked the dirt beneath him. His vision blurred. He felt himself slipping into darkness, but held on long enough to answer one last time with what might have been a whisper, or might have been a prayer. Malik Jalo. Then the world went black. He awoke hours later, lying on his stomach in the slave quarters, every movement searing pain across his torn back. Several enslaved people gathered around him. Some offered small pieces of cloth to keep the flies away. Others murmured in sorrow. He noticed, through the haze of pain, an older man with soft eyes and delicate fingers, a man they called Jonah, whose role on the plantation was to play the fiddle for the Harper family. Jonah spoke to Malik in a mix of broken Mandinka and English, enough to convey meaning, if not nuance. "You must survive," he whispered. "Say their name outside, keep yours inside. Live long enough to remember who you are." Malik listened, but did not answer. His father's words echoed louder than Jonah's advice. A man's name was not a garment to be removed for convenience. It was the essence of his soul. He could not give it up. He would not. The next morning, despite the raw wounds across his back, Malik was forced into the fields. Tobacco cultivation offered no mercy. He watched others bend, plant, weed, and carry out their tasks with the rhythm of people whose bodies had been shaped or broken by the same work for years. Malik, new to the process and unable to understand the overseer's shouted commands, moved slowly and hesitantly. Each mistake earned a slap, a shove, or a blow. His hands blistered, then bled. His back throbbed beneath the coarse shirt that clung to his wounds. Yet Malik observed everything with the sharp eye his father had trained in him since childhood. The angle at which others moved, the timing of tasks, the silent communication among the enslaved workers. Within weeks, despite the language barrier, he had memorized the patterns. He learned how to anticipate Fitch's movements, when the overseer was most alert, when he grew careless, when he was tired. He watched how the older workers cooperated subtly, passing information through glances, gestures, and almost invisible acts of quiet defiance. Fitch believed he commanded the fields completely, but Malik saw the truth. The enslaved people had created their own world, hidden, resilient, and interconnected. Slowly, he gained their respect. Not because he worked well, many did. Not because he endured pain, most had. It was because he carried pain with dignity, and because he still refused to respond to the name Daniel. Weeks turned into months. Malik's English improved. He learned commands first, then simple phrases, then more complex instructions. He began to understand the overseer's curses, the gossip of white workers, the whispered conversations of enslaved families at night. The plantation expanded around him like a living machine, its gears powered by suffering, its profits drawn from blood and bone. The seasons changed. The sweltering Virginian summer gave way to a winter that chilled Malik in ways he could not have imagined. Frost bit through the rags he wore. Breathing the cold air burned his lungs. The quarters leaked wind from every crack. Several people died before spring returned, quietly and without ceremony, buried in shallow graves at the edge of the property. The trauma of the Middle Passage still haunted him, but now he began to understand something even more horrifying. The Middle Passage had only been the beginning. In January of 1768, 6 months after arriving, Malik made his first escape attempt. He didn't plan it with maps or allies or strategy. He simply waited until nightfall, slipped out through the loose board in the quarters, and ran into the forest with nothing but the rags on his back. The cold gnawed at him. His feet cracked open on frozen ground, but he ran until his lungs burned and his legs shook. He followed instinct, not direction, driven by the single, unbroken belief that no man had the right to own another. But Virginia was not a wilderness like Africa. It was a land carved into farms and plantations, with trained hunting dogs and armed slave catchers patrolling the woods. At dawn, the barking of hounds cracked the silence. They were close, too close. Malik ran harder, stumbling through brambles, splashing across icy streams, pushing until his chest felt ready to burst. The men found him by noon.
Slave catcher Thomas Riggs, a man whose reputation for cruelty stretched across multiple counties, tied Malik by the neck and marched him back along the main road, publicly displaying him like a trophy. White travelers sneered or laughed as they passed. Some enslaved people watched with grief. Others turned their eyes away, unable to bear the sight. Back at the Harper plantation, Fitch waited with quiet anticipation. This was not going to be just punishment. This was going to be instruction, and Malik, still breathing, still unbroken, knew that the worst was yet to come.
When Riggs dragged Malik back onto the plantation, the enslaved community had already gathered in a silent semicircle. Word traveled fast in Riverbend County. A runaway had been caught. This always meant blood. Samuel Harper stood on the porch of the main house, arms folded, jaw tight. The overseer paced back and forth like a man preparing for a performance he'd rehearsed many times. Malik, bruised and frostbitten, was shoved to the center of the yard. A line of rope circled his wrists, another around his neck, both held by Riggs's assistants. Harper's expression was colder than before. "You think you can flee my property, boy?" he said. "You think you can defy the law of Virginia?" Malik didn't respond. The winter air seared his lungs. Frost clung to the edges of his torn sleeves. His hands trembled uncontrollably, but not from fear, from exhaustion, from hunger, from the cold that had crept into his bones. "Fitch," Harper said quietly, "teach him." This time, the whipping was not about a name. This was retaliation, designed to break something deeper than skin. Fitch didn't use the leather strap. He used a cowhide whip tipped with knotted cords that tore through flesh with each strike. The first blow ripped across Malik's back, reopening old scars and carving new ones. The second hit lower, forcing a cry from his throat, a sound he tried and failed to swallow. "What's your name?" Fitch shouted, mockingly, imitating Harper's earlier ritual. Malik pressed his lips together, refusing to answer. Blow after blow followed, each splitting his skin, each sending shocks of pain up his spine. The gathered enslaved people watched with haunted eyes. Some clutched their own children, some prayed, some could not bear to look. Riggs leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed, enjoying the spectacle with a smirk. After 30 lashes, Malik's vision blurred, his knees buckled, and he slumped forward. Fitch grabbed him by the hair and forced his head up. "Run again, and you won't be getting just the whip," he hissed. Harper nodded, signaling the beating's end. Malik was thrown into a storage shed, its floor dirt-packed and freezing. For nearly a week he remained there, fed scraps, denied warmth, left with wounds that festered and throbbed. But even in that isolation, he whispered his lineage into the darkness. He needed to hear his own voice, needed to remember the sound of Malik Jalo. Without it, the shedding of his name would become too easy. When he returned to the fields, he worked slowly, each movement igniting pain across his back. Yet nobody mocked him. The enslaved workers moved beside him with subtle gestures of support, a shared handful of greens, a whispered warning when Fitch approached, an extra moment of rest when no one was looking. As winter thawed into spring, Malik learned more about the world he had fallen into. Jonah, the elderly fiddler, taught him English words each night, quietly, secretly, explaining the structure of the plantation, the laws governing enslavement, the punishments for rebellion. Malik listened, absorbing every detail. Before long, he understood something chilling. Escape was not a matter of strength or stamina. It was a matter of distance. Virginia was vast, but every mile was patrolled, claimed, controlled. And the slave-catching network, dogs, riders, bounty hunters, was brutally efficient. Still, Malik could not accept slavery as a permanent condition. He was Mandinka. His father had raised him to believe a man's spirit must remain whole even if the body was chained. His first escape had failed, but failure had never been the end of a warrior's story. The second attempt came in May 1768.
By then, Malik spoke enough English to imitate a servant on an errand. He slipped pieces of food from the kitchen, collecting small rations over weeks, cornbread scraps, dried peas, a bit of jerky. He observed the schedule of riders passing through Riverbend County. He noticed which roads were busiest, which woods were thick enough to hide him, which streams might mask his scent from tracking dogs. This escape lasted longer than the first, 3 days, a remarkable feat. He traveled by night, staying off main paths, drinking from shallow creeks, forcing his wounded body to keep moving. He imagined reaching the north, reaching a place where slavery had begun to erode. He imagined walking into a free town where nobody owned bodies, where nobody changed names. He imagined seeing the ocean again, not as a prisoner, but as a free man. But on the 3rd day, exhaustion slowed him. He tried hiding in a barn near a road, but the scent of sweat and blood remained fresh. Riggs's dogs caught it easily. When the hunters surrounded him, Malik didn't fight. He was too drained to run, and he knew that fighting would mean death before he had a chance to speak his name again. They bound his hands, looped the rope around his neck, and marched him back publicly, just as before. Many people along the road watched. Some shook their heads. Some muttered praise for Riggs. A few enslaved people pressed their hands to their chests, signaling silent solidarity. They knew. They knew the cost of running. They knew the courage of those who tried. This time, Harper did not bother with a whipping. He had a different punishment in mind, one sanctioned by law, one practiced in plantations across the colonies, one designed not to kill, but to destroy the possibility of escape permanently. Amputation. Fitch brought Malik into the tool shed. Jonah tried to intervene but was shoved aside. Dr. Henry Harper, Samuel's brother and a trained physician, prepared his saw, his knife, and a bucket of water. No anesthetic. Slaves were not worth the cost. Malik was tied down. His breath came in harsh bursts. He tried to stay calm, but the knowledge of what was coming pressed against him like suffocation. The doctor pressed Malik's ankle against the wooden table, wiped the blade on a cloth, and began the procedure with clinical detachment. The first cut sliced through skin, the second through muscle. Malik screamed, a sound ripped from deep in his chest, a sound he could not control. Sweat pooled beneath him, his hands shook violently, his back arched as pain tore through him. He tried to remember his father's lessons, he tried to remember Banira, he tried to hold on to his name, but the pain hovered too close to madness. The doctor worked methodically, separating flesh from bone, then bringing the saw to finish the work. The scraping, grinding sound rattled in Malik's skull. He felt the bone vibrate, felt his consciousness slip, felt his body betray him. When the foot finally separated, he fainted. The operation succeeded, if its purpose was to break a man's ability to flee. Malik would never run again, not in any way that could outpace dogs or riders. But Harper didn't understand what else the procedure had done. It had not broken Malik's spirit, it had transformed him. Because now, every enslaved person on the plantation would remember him. The African who ran twice, the African who screamed but never surrendered his name, the African who survived a punishment meant to erase all hope. They whispered stories of him in the quarters, they told their children, they repeated the details even when white ears might have heard. Malik had become more than a slave, he had become a symbol, not of victory, but of refusal. Malik's recovery was long, brutal, and filled with moments where death might have seemed like an easier answer. They placed him in the dimmest corner of the slave quarters on a rough mattress stuffed with straw. The air reeked of sweat, sickness, and winter dampness still lingering in the walls. Infection hovered over the wound like a patient predator. Fever rose and fell, sometimes burning so hot the others laid cool rags across his face, sometimes leaving him shivering uncontrollably despite the heat of summer creeping in. The pain never fully stopped. It merely shifted its shape, retreating into a dull throb before stabbing forward again in sharp, merciless waves. But every day, Jonah visited. The old fiddler had a calmness about him that even Fitch respected. Jonah would sit near Malik's pallet and speak softly in his mix of English and Mandinka. He brought bits of herbs gathered from the forest, poultices passed secretly between enslaved people from different plantations, and small scraps of food collected over the day. He sang sometimes, songs whose melodies carried hints of Africa, though the words had been reshaped by decades of survival in Virginia. The songs reminded Malik of Banira, of his father's workshop, of his mother's hands smoothing his hair when he was a child. They reminded him he was still someone. The enslaved community cared for him in ways the Harper family never noticed. Grace, the cook who ran the plantation kitchen, brought broth when she could, claiming it was leftovers unwanted by the Harpers. Jonah helped change Malik's bandages. A woman named Noura, who'd been a healer before she was stolen from the Igbo lands, kept a close watch on the wound, muttering prayers over it and pressing herbs into the inflamed skin until the infection finally lessened. These acts, small rebellions of compassion, wove Malik into a network that white overseers never understood existed, a world beneath their world, a community forged from suffering but strengthened by the determination to keep each other alive. By late summer, Malik could sit up. By early fall, he could stand with the help of a carved wooden crutch Jonah had shaped for him. Dr. Henry Harper had sold Malik to his brother Samuel for a reduced price, believing he would no longer function well in the fields. And so Malik, with one foot gone and the other unsteady from months of disuse, was reassigned. His field days were over.
Samuel Harper brought him into closer contact with the main house, first assigning him to garden tasks, then to basic household chores. Eventually, Malik's steadiness, silence, and observational nature impressed Henry Harper, who often needed someone to drive his buggy across Riverbend County. The doctor found that Malik, despite everything done to him, followed instructions carefully and avoided mistakes. He was strong enough to lift supplies, patient enough to wait for long stretches, and quiet enough to be unobtrusive in the presence of white families. Harper valued reliability above all else, and Malik had learned to survive by moving carefully through this dangerous world. Driving the buggy opened a new window into white society. Malik saw the homes of wealthy landowners, the gatherings where men discussed crops, taxes, and politics, the casual ways they spoke about enslaved people, his assets, his property, his problems, but never as humans. He listened as ministers sermonized about obedience, conveniently forgetting that their Bible also spoke of freedom. He observed the rituals of white families, dinners, dances, church services, and saw how in the midst of supposed civility, the foundation of their comfort rested entirely on suffering like his. Yet, Malik did not feel hatred as much as clarity. He began to understand the system not as a collection of cruel individuals, but as a structure built on blindness. They could not see him, not truly. They had been raised to believe he was less, and for many of them, it was easier to believe a lie than confront their own dependence on it. Grace became Malik's anchor during this period. She had been born on a different plantation and sold to the Harpers as a teenager. She understood both the cruelty and the compromises required to survive slavery. Grace was quieter than Jonah, but fiercer beneath the surface, her strength manifesting not through defiance but through endurance. She managed the kitchen with precision and ran the household larder with a sharp understanding of scarcity. She was respected, fearlessly so, by the other enslaved women. They spoke first through necessity, brief exchanges when Malik came to deliver supplies for the kitchen. But over weeks, those words changed. Grace asked about his wound, about the pain. Malik asked about the harvest, about the seasons, about the stories Grace had heard from elders who remembered Africa. Grace had not been born there, but her mother had, and she passed down fragments of culture, words, songs, superstitions that kept their lineage alive.
Grace saw something rare in Malik, a man who had refused to surrender his name, a man who had endured torment without letting the world inside him crack, a man whose silence carried depth, not emptiness. Their bond grew slowly, in stolen moments, in whispered conversations in the garden, in shared glances across the yard, in the quiet understanding that neither of them had chosen this life, yet both had refused to let it erase them. In 1771, Grace became pregnant. Malik felt a rush of fear and pride in equal measure. In Mandinka culture, fatherhood represented survival, a continuation of lineage, a passing down of heritage. But here, in Virginian slavery, fatherhood came with a brutal truth. A child would be born into bondage, owned from the moment of birth. Malik's joy was weighed down by terror. He wanted to protect this new life, but protection was a luxury enslaved people rarely possessed. When the baby girl was born in the spring of 1772, Grace allowed Malik to whisper a Mandinka name over her. He called her Mara, strength that does not bend. The name was spoken only in the privacy of the quarters, never in the presence of whites. To them, she was simply Mary, a child meant to grow into labor and exhaustion. But to Malik, she was Malik Jalo, heir to a history the Harpers could not comprehend. He told her stories as she slept in Grace's arms, stories of Banira, of the river his village had lived beside, of the drums that spoke truth when words were forbidden. He told her about her grandfather Moru, about her ancestors traced across 7 generations. Grace listened quietly, knowing the danger, but understanding the necessity. "Teach her," she whispered, but gently. "The world won't let her stay a child for long." And she was right. Because in a society built on bondage, even children carried chains long before they could walk.
Mara grew quickly, her childhood unfolding within the narrow boundaries carved out for enslaved children. She learned to walk between rows of tobacco plants, to speak in soft tones when white voices were nearby, and to never ask why some doors could be opened and others never touched. Yet from her earliest years, she carried an alertness that mirrored her father's. Her eyes studied everything, the gestures adults used, the way overseers moved, the rhythms of work and rest. Grace often said Mara had been born knowing the world was dangerous. Malik whispered Mandinka words to her whenever they found moments alone. Not full sentences, those would draw attention, but single words weighted with generations of history. River, harvest, drum, home. He taught her the name Malik Jalo before she understood what names meant. Grace added her own lessons, teaching prayers, secret recipes, and the hidden ways enslaved women communicated warnings to each other. Together, they shaped Mara's identity from the threads of 2 worlds, one stolen from Africa, one forged in bondage. By the time she was 7, Mara had developed a friendship that was both unexpected and perilous. Lydia Harper, the young niece of Dr. Henry Harper, visited the plantation with her mother during summers. Lydia was close in age to Mara, and in the naive innocence of childhood, she saw no difference between them, except the one explained in whispers by adults she barely understood. Lydia was white and free. Mara was black and enslaved. But to the children, those words carried no meaning yet. Lydia adored reading. She brought books wherever she went, and with the bright eagerness of a child wanting to share her world, she began showing them to Mara. At first, it was just pictures, then simple letters, then words, and Mara, sharp-eyed, curious, learned quickly. Too quickly. Grace noticed Lydia tracing letters for Mara in the dirt behind the kitchen house. Panic flickered in her eyes. Teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in Virginia. It was considered dangerous, subversive. A literate slave could forge passes, read maps, communicate in ways overseers could not control. Punishments were brutal. Whippings, imprisonment, sail to the deep south. Grace pulled Mara aside that night. "You must not let anyone see you learning," she warned. "Lydia means no harm, but harm will come." But Mara, still a child, could not yet imagine the consequences.
Lydia continued teaching her in secret corners, words Mara traced with her fingers, sentences she practiced until they flowed like water across her tongue. Malik watched with conflicting emotions, awe at her daughter's brilliance, terror at the danger it invited, and a quiet hope he barely allowed himself to feel. Knowledge was power. Power could lead to survival or destruction. Years passed. Mara grew into a young woman who could read better than many whites in Riverbend County. She kept her literacy hidden, using it only with Lydia, and even then with caution. But secrets on plantations never remained buried forever. Around this time, a young enslaved man named Noah arrived at a neighboring farm. Noah had been born into slavery, but carried a restless energy, cunning, ambitious, unwilling to remain quiet in the face of unbearable conditions. He and Mara met during Sunday gatherings, where enslaved people from nearby farms attended church in groups separated from the whites. Noah noticed Mara's intelligence, her confidence, the way she listened more than she spoke. Mara noticed his determination, the fire in his eyes that reminded her of Malik. Their friendship deepened into affection, and affection, in the world of slavery, was both a blessing and a curse. Love could not be protected. Lovers could not choose their futures together. Any moment, any sale, any punishment could tear them apart. Noah had no intention of living the rest of his life in bondage. By the age of 19, he had mapped out escape routes, tested weaknesses in patrol patterns, and gathered rumors about safe places farther north. Pennsylvania, he heard, was a land where slavery was dying. Freedom was not guaranteed, but possible. "I can make it," he told Mara one humid spring evening, hope glowing dangerously in his voice. "I can get north, and once I'm safe, I'll come back for you. I swear it." Mara felt wonder and dread. The promise seemed impossible, but Noah believed it with his whole heart. When he returned days later with a desperate request, she understood the risk even before he spoke it. "I need a travel pass," he whispered, "a forged one, written neatly, like a white man wrote it." Mara froze. She knew what this meant. "I can't if they discover."
"They won't," he insisted. "You're the only one who can do it. Without that pass, they'll catch me before I reach the county line." Mara's heart pounded. She thought of Malik's missing foot. She thought of Jonah's warnings. She thought of the whip Fitch carried so easily. But she also thought of Noah's eyes, of the longing for freedom that mirrored her father's before it was violently severed. She thought of possibility. That night, she did it. She copied the handwriting of Dr. Harper's clerk with remarkable precision, crafting a document that granted Noah permission to travel for a fictional errand. When she handed it to him, her hands shook. Noah embraced her, whispering promises of return. He left before dawn. 2 days later, cracked leather boots stomped into the slave quarters. Overseers dragged Mara outside. Noah had been caught. The forged pass had been found. A slave catcher recognized the handwriting as too refined for Noah. The trail had led straight to her. Dr. Henry Harper was livid. An enslaved girl who could read and write was a threat, a seed of rebellion. To him, the solution was obvious and immediate. Sell her. Within hours, Mara was chained to a wagon headed south, bound for the plantation of a man named Jacob Tillman in North Carolina, a trader known for harsh discipline and quick profits. She wasn't allowed to say goodbye to Grace, to Jonah, or to anyone else. She was property being relocated. When Malik learned of her sale, something inside him shattered in a way that even the amputation had not accomplished. He had survived capture, the ocean, the whip, mutilation, and still kept his identity intact. But losing Mara, losing the daughter whose name he had whispered into the night, losing the last of his lineage within reach, it hollowed him. He walked the plantation silently for weeks. He did his tasks without mistake. He spoke when spoken to. But the spark, the fire that had endured through so much, dimmed. Not extinguished, but dimmed. The enslaved people noticed the change.
Jonah noticed, Grace noticed, even Fitch, though incapable of compassion, noticed a stillness in Malik that felt unsettling. Mara was gone. Not dead, but gone in a way the law made permanent. Malik knew the truth that every enslaved parent feared. Slavery did not merely own bodies, it devoured families. And in the quiet that followed, Malik's world narrowed to a single, unyielding vow. If he could not save his daughter, he would save her memory. No matter how many years passed, no matter how many chains were laid on him, he would ensure she lived on through her name, just as he had done with his own.
Mara's journey to North Carolina blurred into a haze of roads, dust, and fear. She sat chained among strangers, men, women, a few terrified children, each sold off from different plantations. Jacob Tillman, the trader who'd purchased her, drove the wagon with the casual cruelty of someone long practiced in the business of breaking people. Mara tried to stay silent, her mind drifting between memories of Malik's whispered stories and the harsh reality ahead. Every bump of the wagon reminded her she was no longer just enslaved, she was displaced, torn from her family, her home, and everything familiar. Tillman's plantation was smaller than the Harpers, but no less brutal. Mara was put to work, cleaning, cooking, tending the yards, and assisting with laundry. The whipping posts here bore fresh scars from daily punishments. Overseers shouted more often, the threats were sharper, the air thicker with fear. Yet Mara adapted, as enslaved people always had to. She learned the routines. She kept her head down. She held her literacy in silence, folding it tightly inside her like a hidden blade. Years passed. Mara grew into adulthood, her beauty noted by Tillman in a way that made her skin crawl. One evening, summoned to his quarters, she learned a cruel truth about enslaved women. Their bodies could be taken as easily as their names. The son that resulted, whom she named Elijah in secret, became her entire purpose. Elijah possessed her eyes, her intelligence, and a softness she feared the world would crush. She whispered Mandinka words into his ear as Malik had once done for her. She told him of Banira, though she had never seen it. She told him of his grandfather's strength. She told him his name meant, God has heard. Elijah grew into a lively boy with a talent for taming animals. Chickens in particular followed him as though enchanted. The other enslaved people began calling him Bird Boy Elijah, a name that would change and evolve as he did. Mara taught him to read in secret, using scraps of newspapers and discarded pages. She knew the danger, but after everything she had lost, she refused to let the world steal this from her child. Back in Virginia, Malik continued serving as Dr. Harper's buggy driver. His limp made each step deliberate, but his mind remained sharp. He noticed details others overlooked. The shifting mood of the county as news of rebellion in the Caribbean spread. The whispers about resistance among enslaved people. The tension in white families who feared uprisings but refused to question the system that fueled them. Malik spoke little of Mara after her sale. The ache lived too deep inside him, but he never stopped saying her name at night. Grace sometimes heard him murmuring it in the darkness, a prayer sent into a world that never answered. As the years slid into decades, Riverbend County changed. Children who had once played in the yards became adults working the fields. Jonah died quietly one winter, his fiddle strings forever still. Grace aged but remained the quiet backbone of the quarters. Malik, now gray-haired and slower in movement, watched generation after generation grow up under the same chains that had bound him for so long. Yet he never forgot Banira, never forgot his Mandinka lineage, never forgot his name. By the early 1800s, Malik was nearly 60, remarkably old for someone who had survived the Middle Passage and decades of forced labor. His back bore scars from whips that had long since rotted away. His missing foot no longer pained him, but formed part of his silhouette, a symbol remembered by every new child on the plantation. To them, he was a living legend, the man who ran twice, who kept his African name, who endured mutilation without surrender. Grace told the children stories of Malik's youth in Africa, filling in what she could from his tales. Malik listened quietly, surprised sometimes by the versions she created, but he never corrected her. What mattered was the memory living on. One night, a young boy in the quarters asked, "Why didn't they ever take your name?" Malik looked at him for a long moment before answering. "They tried," he said softly, "but a name only disappears if you let it die inside you. I did not." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but the others heard. They always heard. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, Elijah, now called Rooster Eli due to his skill with fighting birds, grew into a tall, wiry young man. He inherited his mother's intelligence and her courage. Elijah gained favor with Tillman due to his skill in managing gamecocks, which brought money and prestige to the plantation. For the first time in generations, one of Mara's kin might secure enough privilege to negotiate freedom. Mara aged more quickly than Malik had. The weight of survival pressed harder on women. But she lived long enough to see Elijah earn his freedom, something unthinkable for most enslaved men. When Elijah left the plantation, Mara hugged him tightly, whispering the words her father had whispered to her. "You are more than they say you are. Remember where you come from." Elijah carried her story northward, and in time to his children, who carried it to theirs. Through them, Mara's memory lived, and through Mara's memory, Malik lived too. In Virginia, Malik's final years were quieter. His body weakened, his limp grew heavier. Grace passed away one spring, leaving him more alone than ever. The Harper family evolved across generations, but Malik remained the constant shadow in their household, the enslaved man who had been there longer than many of them had been alive. By the early 1820s, Malik no longer drove the buggy. His vision blurred, his hands trembled, and John, the grandson of Samuel, assigned him to light chores around the barn. No one spoke of his history. No one asked about the stories etched into his scars. One cold morning in 1823, Malik lay down in his small cabin and did not rise again. His breathing slowed, his eyes drifted closed. He whispered his name one final time, Malik Jalo, and in that whisper, Benira lived again. Its river flowing, its drums echoing, its sky stretching unbroken and free. He died quietly, with no family beside him, no stone to mark his grave. In the plantation ledger, his death was recorded simply, Daniel, approximate 70 years, deceased. But that was not the truth. The truth lived elsewhere. It lived in Mara's stories told to Elijah beneath the North Carolina moon. It lived in Elijah teaching his children that his grandfather had been a warrior. It lived in the grandchildren who carried forward fragments of Mandinka words. It lived in the great-grandchildren who whispered African names they had never seen written. It lived in the generations who survived slavery's horrors and still remembered where their blood came from. And in time, long after Malik's bones returned to the earth, his story resurfaced through the voices of descendants who traced their ancestry back across states, across rivers, across centuries. Through oral histories preserved despite everything meant to erase them, the story of Malik Jalo crossed back over oceans of time to become known again. Not as Daniel, but as the man he truly was. A son of Benira, a Mandinka warrior, a survivor of the Middle Passage, a parent who whispered heritage into a night designed to silence him. A man who lived and died enslaved, but who never surrendered the only thing the world could not steal, his name.